blessing. Number 3, the Christian regeneration of this pagan celebration. First we have the celebration of Christmas, Christ coming to the earth. Then we have this pagan deal that just kind of has a lot of parallels to what we're talking about, but it's all paganism. What did the early church do with this? Now, first of all, how did they get it to be a challenge? Well, what happened was that the Christians were overcoming the empire. And I mentioned this on Sunday. Every time they killed Christians, a couple more people would come to Christ. And so the emperors were faced with a growing wave of this followers of the way. And so they didn't know what to do. Now, one of the emperors decided he would try and decimate Christians. And so he did. And he just went out and he destroyed in huge numbers all of the buildings, all of their Bibles. He killed all the leaders. And then at the end, his name was Julian the Apostate. And at the end, he was going into battle against the Christians, and he was struck down. And as he was lying on the ground in the battlefield, he was laying in his own blood, and he looked up, and history records he shook his fist, and he said, "You have conquered, O Galilean." That was a turning point in the persecution. And no one did quite as much as Julian the Apostate after that. And finally, Christianity was the majority. So Constantine, who was a smart fella, in 310 A.D., issued a law called religio licita, or licita, which means the freedom of religion in the empire. And then, 3 years later, in 313, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. But the problem was the whole Roman Empire was filled with gods and altars and temples and everything. And most of those people were paid by the emperor. It's kind of like the civil service, only it was a religious civil service. And so he had to figure out what to do with all those, because he had all these Christians and he had all these pagans. So what he did is he said, we're going to just make one big church and we're just going to call it all Christianity. Have you ever wondered where candles and robes and beads and little, idols all around the place and orders of monks and orders of priests and orders of this, did you ever wonder where all that came from? It came by the inclusion of all the paganism in. The early church never had anything to do with robes and candles and holy days and Lent. Do you know what Lent is? I'm sorry, it's not Easter, but I'll tell you right now. Lent is the pagan celebration of the death of Baal and the mourning of Tammuz, his mother, for 40 days until he came back to life at the end of 40 days. When is Lent? It's 40 days before what? Yeah, Easter. All that is an old pagan thing that was sucked into the church in 313 A.D. How about purgatory? Where did purgatory come from? Purgatory was an old myth that the Eastern religions believed in, of this kind of this limbo place you could go to get cleaned up. And after you got cleaned up, you'd go to paradise. And paradise, that word, comes from Persian language. It's an old Persian idea of paradise. In fact, almost every Muslim, when they die in battle, they're going to paradise. Not really, but that's what they think. And so the church has sucked all this in 313. Well, part of that, they started evaluating all this stuff that came in. So now look at your sheets here. By the year AD 360, the church was celebrating the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ. Now, it was not a big deal. They did not make a shrine out of Christ's tomb until modern times, because Christ wasn't there. Now, every time I go to the Holy Land, it's one of the most memorable spots. I love going to the Garden Tomb. The early church wasn't enamored with the tomb. Why? They were enamored with the what? Risen Christ, not the tomb. We use a tomb as a reminder that he's risen, but back then they said, hey, he's risen, we're not going to worry about the tomb. But by 360, they started commemorating his birth, his life, his death, and his resurrection. Now, by 386 A.D., Chrysostom, he was the golden-mouthed orator. They said when he talked, everyone was just, he preached in Constantinople, which is present-day Istanbul. There we go. Thanks. Modern Turkish Istanbul is old-fashioned Constantinople, which was where Constantine ran the western half of the empire, or the eastern half of the empire from. But when he preached in that Hagia Sophia, that huge cathedral that's still there, the people, it said, would sit there spellbound by the hour. He was a mesmerizing speaker. Well, in 386, he was preaching, without the birth of Christ, there is no baptism. See, there was a kind of a group of people that says, we're not going to celebrate this birth of Christ. We're only going to celebrate that he rose. And he says, wait a minute. Without the birth, there's no baptism, there's no passion, there's no resurrection, there's no ascension, and there's no pouring out of the Holy Spirit, which is very logical. How did Christ get here? It's the dawning of the light. It's the mystery of the incarnation. So, as the centuries went on, the tradition grew to include Epiphany. That's the manifestation when the angel came and told Mary that Christ was going to come. And when Christ was circumcised the 8th day after his birth, and the Eastern Church celebrates not only the Epiphany, the manifestation, not only his birth, and they also celebrate on January 6th his circumcision, 8 days after his birth. So, I mean, there's just a lot of stuff tacked onto this, and you can see it all if you ever look at a religious calendar.